Okay, so today on the Profit podcast, as I've just mentioned in the introduction, we've got Tom Bainbridge with us today, and he's going to be discussing some really sort of key, interesting points around the field of nutrition. So before we dive into that, Tom, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you here.
Hey, Matt, how are you doing? Thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, very good. Thank you, mate. It's good to have you here with us today. And, quite a lot of our listeners, Tom, I imagine already know a little bit about you and a little bit about what you do. But for those who don't, give us a little idea about your story so far. We're always interested in knowing where people have come from, how they got passionate about a certain subject, and sort of what got them to where they are today. So give us a little flavour of that from your perspective.
Cool. Well, I'll be very surprised if anyone doesn't know who I am. No one tends to. I tend to get comments on podcasts that I really need to do more with my own social media because I just don't. But yeah, so I'm Tom. I am the manager of the BTN Academy. So I run a nutrition academy that falls under Ben Coomber Limited. So I work with Ben Coomber. I run the education side of that business. As far as a story, I suppose, so I was an overweight kid. I was overweight up until I was about 14, 15. I live in an area where if you don't do football, you don't do sport. And I'm garbage at football, so I just didn't do sport up until I was 14 when we started doing rugby. And I found because I was bigger than everyone else, I was all right at that. And that was how I sort of started to be introduced into the area of exercise. Found a real love for sport in general, found a few different things I was quite good at, and through that I lost a fair bit of weight. And so I just decided, right, well, sport, fitness, all of this kind of stuff, it's quite fun, isn't it? I haven't got any other plans, so I'll just do that for a living. And so I went to college, studied exercise science there, and shortly after college, I kind of fell out of love with everything for a little bit. I went through sort of a phase in my late teens where I was a bit of a bum, decided to not go to university, which is still a mistake, I think, because Open University takes forever when you try to catch up later on. I probably should have done university at the normal time. That would have saved me an awful lot of sort of heartache later on, but still. So I fell out of college and I went and worked in a factory because you made a lot of money that way, and I was 19. And I was like, right, I want to earn loads of money right now. I'm not going to think about the future. While I was in the factory, I ended up with a few mental illnesses, which sort of held me back a lot. And I kind of hit rock bottom, I suppose, towards my early 20s. And all of this time, I wasn't doing any sport. I wasn't doing any exercise. Nothing was particularly good. Then in the process of rebuilding myself, I had to learn more about nutrition. I had to learn a bit more about exercise because I was a human being that needed to sort of fix all of my health problems, which come along with various mental illnesses. So during that process, I ended up knowing quite a lot about things. I'm a person that likes learning. And so when I start doing something, I don't just do it. I learn how to do it properly. And I'm the kind of person where it's like, right, I don't have a lot of hobbies, but the few hobbies that I do have, I want to know what I'm really doing so that I'm quite good at it. And I just approached fitness in that kind of way. So this takes me to when I'm about 23. I'm just eyeballing numbers here. Started working in a supplement shop owned by a friend of mine who was on the TV show Gladiators, like the reboot version. So he was Warrior in that. He started opening a supplement shop, ended up working there. While I spent my time there, I just started reading research papers, lots and lots and lots of research papers, because that's the way that you know stuff that's not been filtered through blogs. It's not been filtered through ideological people who support low carb or intermittent fasting or whatever the flavor of the moment is. It's just, this is the data. And through that, a few people started realizing in the store that I actually knew what I was doing. Ended up being a coach through that. Just people asking me all like, will you manage my nutrition? Will you manage my exercise? Because you know what it is that you're doing. And through that, I ended up speaking to Ben. Ben brought me on to do a little bit of social media marketing, and I suppose the rest is history. I just started working more and more closely with Ben, started taking a bigger role within the business. And yeah, he took the step to enable me to manage the academy because I thought I could do it. And I like to think that having written 5 books for the academy now, I've done a decent job of it, I suppose.
Well, yeah, if you're gonna measure any results, they're fairly decent, aren't they? So, in and amongst all that, then, Tom, why do you think it was that it was more the nutrition side that you fell into? Was that just the bit that you were more interested in? Like, was there a particular passion around that area?
I think it was probably happenstance. I think during the period when I was learning more stuff, it was primarily because I was working in a supplement shop. And so the supplement shop that I worked in, I was fortunate that it had an ethical stance in that diet comes first, supplements come second. There's a lot of supplement places that you go to that just try to sell you anything, whereas this store wasn't like that. We wanted our clientele to have an experience because you've got to bear in mind, this was at the time when my protein was really taken off, when the protein works was really taken off. And so we're standing there as a brick and mortar store with overheads trying to sell branded products, which are more expensive than the internet. And so we needed to ensure that we could provide a service alongside a product. And that service came as sort of nutrition coaching. And so I just needed to really learn what I was doing. And had it been that I was working in a gym, I probably would have taken up strength and conditioning. But to be honest, I've learned that as well. Just because I don't think you can coach without having both. That's one thing that I'll sort of just chuck into the podcast now. I don't think a strength and conditioning coach can be the top of their game without having some nutrition knowledge. And I don't think a nutrition coach can be top of their game without having some exercise knowledge. I think both are important. But yeah, was it that I was employed by a friend who'd opened a gym? I think my life probably would have taken a different trajectory, but I guess this is where I fell. And as I say, I like learning, so I can generally find anything interesting as long as I can read about it. So I ended up with that.
Cool. And as you mentioned there, you sort of touched on the term nutrition coaching, which takes us nicely into one of the key topics we want to talk about today. So just so the audience have got a bit of context as to what we're going to talk about here, in the build up to arranging this interview with Tom, I asked him about, what are the key areas you would like to talk about that you feel a personal trainer based audience probably needs to know a little bit more about, could probably do with a little help with. And Tom mentioned two key areas. So the first of those is learned self-helplessness. You mentioned this in an email, Tom. I'll be quite honest. When I saw it, I immediately copied and pasted it into Google to find out exactly what it was. I had an idea of what it was. But talk to us a little bit about why it was that you brought that up. Why is that a conversation you want to have today? What is it all about? How does it relate to us as trainers, coaches, whoever it is in relation to nutrition?
Great question. So when people think about nutrition coaching or nutritionists or whatever it is people want to call themselves, from a public perspective, so not necessarily practitioners, from a public perspective, we tend to think of a nutritionist or a nutrition coach as someone who will tell you what to eat. We view it as it's a knowledge deficit, knowledge surplus relationship, which is the kind of relationship that you have with your GP. So let's say you've had really bad headaches for the last 3 weeks. You go to the doctor. Why are you there? You're there because hopefully the doctor knows what the problem is and you don't. And so you're in that situation because you're wanting to be given answers. You're like, right, what is the problem? How do I fix it? He tells you, right, you need to do this thing, and then you go off and do it. And that is the way that most people view nutrition coaching. It's, I know all of the nutrition stuff. You don't. Therefore, when I give you the nutrition stuff, you'll go off and do it and everything will be fine. Now, in the real world, that's not how it works, because a knowledge surplus deficit relationship only works for acute issues. Like if you've broken your leg and someone tells you how to fix your leg, you'll just do it because the consequences of not doing that are immediate. When we're looking at something along the lines of nutrition coaching, even fitness coaching like personal training, you've got to bear in mind that the consequences for not actually engaging in the advice that the professional has given you are so far away that they're almost abstract. Like if I was to say to you, oh, well, if you're overweight now and you continue on this trajectory, in 2 years' time you'll be obese, and then in 15 years' time that might cause a heart attack. That's 15 years away. You've got enough time, like that the time is so distant that you are afforded the opportunity to go, nah, it won't happen to me. And so you're not going to listen, you're not going to do it. And the consequence of paying attention to what a nutrition coach says is immediate. It's, well, I want to go home and have a bunch of biscuits with a cup of tea, and if I listen to this person, I can't, and I don't want to do that. And so that kind of relationship just doesn't work, and people do not do what you tell them to if you just tell them how to eat. And so the way that I like to approach nutrition conversations, for the case of like podcasts and stuff, is not to sit here and tell you how you can maximally stimulate muscle protein synthesis. what kind of protein and leucine dosage per kilogram of body weight is required, how many times per day to maximize muscle protein synthesis and increase the muscle mass by 1% of an individual who's already jacked. Because most PTs cannot apply that ever. Like, that person isn't looking for a PT in the first place. And even if they were, they would probably go to someone that's going to charge 10 grand a month, and you already know what this person's name is. Like, if you want to build maximal muscle, you're going to go to, I don't know, Dr. Mike Israetel. You're not going to go to a person listen to this podcast. And that's not a slight on people. That's just the way that people at the upper echelons work. And so I think the information that I should give should be relevant to the general population. Now, when we're looking at nutrition that's relevant to the general population, as much as I believe it is very important for people who are coaching to know the ins and outs to an extent of nutrition science, like, I don't think you can really talk about nutrition as an authority unless you know, at least have a vague concept of what the Krebs cycle is. What's the electron transport chain? You don't know what that is, that's fine. You're not going to work. You need to be told that at some point. And if you don't know that, you just haven't been told it, which is fine. But I think you need to know that. But when it comes down to working with the general population, what do we know works? Well, they need adequate calorie balance, which is appropriate for their goal. They need an adequate amount of protein, which is going to be somewhere in the region of 1.6 to maybe 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. A bit less if they're very overweight, because fat mass doesn't influence protein requirements. They need to eat a diet primarily made up of unprocessed foods, ideally with lots of plants. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a plant-based diet, but you'd have lots of fruits and vegetables in there. And it's kind of it. The difficulty, therefore, is not knowing what kind of... And then, of course, there are a few minor details. Yeah, it might help if they're taking fish oils, blah, blah, blah. But the difficulty with a person in the real world who is a general member of the population, who maybe trains twice a week and wants to be able to see their grandkids grow up, the difficulty with their nutrition is not in the finer details, it's in the application. It's actually getting them to do what it is that you want them to do. And that is why I approached it from this angle. So I've gone on a big tangent there, and I'll be honest, I've got what the question was, but I hope that gives some context as to why I thought that Learn's helplessness would be one of the first things I'd like to talk about.
Yeah. Well, the question really was just to give us an idea of what learned self-helplessness is. You know, what it
right.
in relation to our in relation to our industry.
Thanks for that. So, learned helplessness. The best way to explain learned helplessness is to outline the initial experiment which kind of defined it. So back in, I want to say the 70s, might be a bit earlier, people who did psychology at university will probably be like screaming at me now, but a guy called Seligman, who was a psychological researcher, was doing a lot of work with dogs. Now, the way that you do work with dogs as a behavioral psychologist is you can look at either positive or negative reinforcement. So positive reinforcement is just where you do something good, you get a treat. Negative reinforcement is you do something bad happens, so you maybe don't do that bad thing again. And psychologists behavioral psychologists used to argue between themselves for good decades as to what works better, hitting people when they do a bad thing or treating people nicely when they do a good thing. And that argument's still raging on to an extent because it depends on the population you're talking about. But one of the things that they used to do is they used to use dogs, and the negative reinforcement that they used to use would be a small electrical shock. And so let's say you wanted a dog to stay in one half of a cage. What you would do is you would shock them every time they go to the other half of the cage, and then they'd eventually stop going to that half of the cage. Now, I'm not commenting on the ethicalness of this kind of experiment. This is just what it was. But what the researchers used to find was that after a certain amount of time, the dogs just didn't react to the shocks anymore. And people used to think, oh, well, the dogs are just not bothered by the shocks, like they just got used to them. But Seligman didn't think that was right. So what he did was he thought, well, maybe there's something else going on. So he started this experiment. So you've got 3 dogs in 3 cages. One of the dogs, nothing happens. It's just a dog in a cage. 2 other dogs, one of them is getting shocked at like X amount of second intervals, and it's got a little lever. And what has to happen is it's getting shocked, and when it works out that it can pull the lever to stop the shocks, obviously as soon as it starts getting shocked, it'll pull the lever and the shocks will stop. The 3rd dog is in a cage which is getting shocked at the exact same time as the 2nd dog, but it doesn't have a lever. its shocks are controlled by the second dog's lever. So second dog pulls the lever, both of the amounts of shock stop. So what we've got here is we've got a situation where both dogs are getting shocked, but one of them is in control of their situation, and the other one isn't. So you run that experiment for a while, and then you put all three dogs in a really long cage with a little wall in the middle. They're in a side where they're getting shocked through the floor. You put the control dog, the dog that was just in the cage, in this electrocuted side, and as soon as you start shocking it, it jumps over the wall, and it's at safety, and it's a happy dog. So that's what would happen had this experiment not been undertaken. So now you look at the two experimental dogs. The one where it had a lever, similarly to the control dog, it just jumps over the wall and it protects itself from the shocks. But the dog that wasn't in control, what happens with that one is it just lies down and whimpers because it has learned that it's helpless. It's learned helplessness. It just understands that it's not in control of its situation because it hasn't previously been in control of its situation, and so it doesn't act in order to save itself. Now, obviously that's a dog experiment, and humans are a bit more complicated than that, but these experiments have been replicated in not similar, because you can't electrocute people, but in similar situations. So one of them would be, for example, people could be given a puzzle that they've got to do, and it's a very hard puzzle, and they need to complete that puzzle in order to make a really annoying buzzing noise stop. Now, if you give people an impossible puzzle versus if you give people a puzzle that's solvable, the people who have been given the impossible puzzle will then give up way quicker on subsequent tasks. So this translates to humans too. Now, where this relates to nutrition, after that 10-minute offshoot, is that we need to look at nutrition from the perspective of a person who, in their honest opinion, has tried everything to lose weight and failed. So we always hear this, oh, you've tried everything, but you haven't tried a calorie deficit, have you? But if people are really honest with themselves, they understand that when a member of the public says that they've tried everything, they believe that. They believe that they've tried everything that is within their capability to lose weight, and they haven't been able to. So let's say you go through, over the course of 15 years, 5 rounds of trying to lose weight, and every time you either lose a little bit and then put it back on, or maybe a bit more, or you just don't lose any weight at all. At this point, an individual has come subconsciously to the conclusion that they just can't lose weight. They identify as an overweight person who can't lose weight. You see this all the time in people who either come to the gym for years and never lose anything, people who say, oh, I'll try to lose weight and I just can't, this is just the way I am. Or the one that kind of bugs me quite a lot is the people that go to something like Slimming World or Weight Watchers for like 10 years and never make any progress. Like, that is a person that has identified with the fact that they can't lose weight. And we see this so often as trainers and coaches, because these are the people, again, who will come to you and say, oh, I've tried everything. And so we as coaches need to be aware of learning self-helplessness, because it informs our worldview when we are speaking to people who have tried multiple times to lose weight. If you get a client who comes to you and you say, oh, what's your dieting history? And say, oh, well, I've been trying for years to lose weight and it never works. You understand that you've got a person in front of you that believes that. And where this relates to learned helplessness is because that is going to predispose them to be less motivated to attempt any weight loss intervention in the future. So as soon as your weight loss approach that you suggest becomes quite difficult, they're going to give up. As soon as they're tempted to do something that would perhaps be a little bit off track, whatever the track is that you've determined for them, they're just going to give up. They're going to stop. They're going to feel unmotivated. And you're going to be coming into client check-ins repeatedly over and over again, and they'll be like, oh, I just can't stick to it. I just don't know why. And this, I'm not going to say this is why, but this is potentially why. This is one of the explanations for that being the case. And I think it can be very easy for people who are in fitness, because, of course, this industry self-selects a certain type of person. If you're in this industry, if you're listening to this podcast, you probably like fitness quite a bit. And if you're looking at nutrition from a scientific perspective in terms of trying to improve your health, and you're trying to eat in a manner that is promoting health, that is because you have an inherent psychological predisposition to do so. And so you probably, I'm not going to say you find it really easy, but you find it easier, obviously, by definition, than the people that can't do it. And so we can often forget that there are people out there that genuinely do have mental barriers to success in terms of improving their nutrition, in terms of losing weight. And just being aware that this is a phenomenon, I think, enables you to relate a little bit better to the clients, have a little bit more empathy, And then the next thing that we're going to talk about can help you maybe work around it.
Yeah. So let's say that you start working with someone and fairly early on, you highlight that they've potentially got some form of learned self-helplessness then, Tom. Is it something like, do you approach that? Is that something that you make them aware of, like as a coach? You know, is there anything you do with that early on, or is it literally something that you just make a note of so that once you do set them up on a plan, you're aware that there is a chance they might fail, and if they do so, this might be one of the reasons why? Like, how do you normally use that information as a coach?
Oh, absolutely. I think I'm a big proponent of communication and honest, open discussion with clients. I think we are a service industry, but we're also a relationship industry as much as we're a fitness industry. And I don't think you can build a relationship, whether it is private or professional, based upon hidden information. And so, but at the same time, obviously, I'm not suggesting that we're psychologists and we shouldn't be sat there diagnosing people with stuff. So I don't think learned helplessness is a diagnosis. It's a phenomenon, I suppose. But the way you would discuss it with the client is just essentially when they bring up in their consultation, oh, I've tried losing weight loads of times before and it never works, make a note of that. And then when it comes to their third check-in and they haven't lost any weight and you talk around it and you find that actually, no, they haven't stuck to the plan. A really good question that you can ask there is, how do you view this approach as being any different to any approach that you've used in the past? Because that is going to force them to explain to you why what they're doing now is different to the stuff that's failed before. You're basically getting them to answer the wrong question. And then all you can do, you can hone in on that answer and say, all right, well, that's cool. I mean, I know it's disappointing that obviously the previous approaches you've taken haven't worked, but this one, as you've just explained, is measurably different. So it's always worth trying something a bit different and see if that has a different outcome, right? And they'll be like, yeah. And that little conversation there, I'm not going to say it's going to be the magic bullet, but that can just change their mindset. And what you might need to do is throughout that week, throughout that month, throughout the rest of your coaching process, just keep reminding them of that fact. That yes, you have failed before, but there is a measurable difference between the failed approaches and this current approach. And it might even come down to the fact that you just have to have, just literally say to them, it's unfair to expect a similar approach, a similar result from this approach when this approach is not similar to your previous approaches. Like if you're driving somewhere and you go the wrong way, and then you drive somewhere and go the right way, the second time you're not allowed to expect to get lost.
Yeah.
Like, that's not how that works. And what I did there, incidentally, is an approach that's known as motivational interviewing. Or, well, it's more just client-centered coaching, which is a branch of motivational interviewing. For any of the listeners, if you ever want a book recommendation, Motivational Interviewing for Nutrition and Fitness, I think it's called. It's motivational interviewing for something and nutrition, or nutrition and something, and the front cover's black with a fork on it.
What we'll do is we'll put a link to it in the show notes so that people can find it dead easy then.
I think that book should be given out at level 3. I think that should be every PT reads. So, yeah, check that out. Yep,
magic. And one of the questions I sort of made note of before the interview, which I don't really know if there's an answer to now, Tom, now that we've actually delved into this a little bit, but I mentioned, like, is there anything we should be doing or could be doing to help people from falling into this in the first place? Like, it sounds like a terrible situation to be where you end up with learned self-helplessness within this realm around nutrition or around exercise or around weight gain, weight loss, whatever it is. I suppose it's just better education, is it, along the way, as early as possible, as, you know, as someone like myself who's a parent, like teaching kids the right things early on, making sure that we're doing our bit as early as possible to, you know, give people success in these areas if they are struggling with it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, I don't know the data on this, and so I'm not going to say this with any authority, but I do think that learned helplessness is specific to a given area. So I think if you failed in health promoting activities before, that's not necessarily to say that you would have learned helplessness when it comes to like business or something like that. So if we're gonna take that as a given, if we're gonna make that assumption, because again, I don't know, it's interesting actually. I'll look at that. Make a note of that. I think what PTs and what nutritionists and what fitness people can do is continue putting out good information. Like, I'm a big fan of the idea that the answer to bad information is better information. And we sort of exist in a space that's full of misinformation. We exist in a space where people think there are free foods that you can eat as much of as you want and you're not going to gain weight, or spaces where if you're going to lose weight, you have to eat an incredibly strict and unsustainable diet, or you need to cut out everything that tastes good. And people try these approaches which are set up to fail. Like, these approaches don't work. Like, the statistic that's often trotted out, I don't know if it's true, but it's something like 85 or 95% of people on Weight Watchers who lose weight end up putting it back on in the next 3 years. And so they end up back at Weight Watchers, which is a damn good business model, but it's a recipe for people who've got learned helplessness. And so I suppose the more we can preach the idea of nutrition, while being difficult in practice, is very simple in theory, the stuff I mentioned before: calories, protein, relatively unprocessed natural-ish foods, lots of plants, then people will see that you don't have to stick to these unsustainable approaches. Now, the conversation around whether a diet has to be sustainable or not is an interesting one, but I'll say that a fat loss approach doesn't need to be sustainable, because if you sustain a fat loss approach, that's called starvation and you'll die. A fat loss approach has to be sustainable for the duration of time that is required to lose the weight that you want to lose. But with that parked aside, if people are attempting things that do not allow them to sustain it for the duration of time required to lose the weight they want to lose, then that is a failure. And so if they are surrounded by information that only tells them that these unsustainable approaches work, then it's our job as fitness professionals to counteract that, not by calling people out, because I don't think that works, but by just spreading better information where we can. And then I suppose we can then move on to what the next topic is going to be when that comes up.
Yeah, well, let's slide into that next one now then, because the other area you wanted to talk about was self-determination theory. Again, not something that we hear bandied around a lot, which is why what you're doing with the way you educate people is a little bit differently. It's probably something we should know about a little bit more of. So again, just talk to us a little bit about that, Tom. What does it mean? How does it relate to us and our clients, and how does it relate to the area of nutrition in particular?
Definitely. So I think self-determination theory is now taught at level 3. I'm not sure. I think it's briefly mentioned, but I just don't know whether many people who teach level 3 really know what it is, and so I don't know if they give it much weight. But self-determination theory is a psychological model of motivation, which I think, I'm not going to say it's outdated, but it's quite old now, but it's still quite illustrative for our purposes. There are areas of life to which it doesn't apply, but I don't think this is one of them. So I'm not saying this is like cutting edge psychology again. I think it's from the 80s. But again, it applies and it works in our industry. So self-determination theory posits the worldview that the way we look at motivation is wrong, fundamentally. So if you talk to anybody about how PTs work, I suppose is probably a good way to do it, is they motivate their clients. You're there to give motivation to your clients. And self-determination theory completely flips that on its head, because the idea that a PT or a nutrition coach or whatever motivates their client is an implicit suggestion that clients start off without motivation and it needs to come from an external source. Now, if you look at any of the data on behavior change and internal versus external motivation, internal motivation wins out every time. Yeah, sometimes you might need to start out with external motivation. Like if you're just starting to exercise, looking at a picture of Arnold's not the worst thing in the world, but that motivation needs to become internalized at some point. So self-determination theory just posits that people are inherently motivated to do health-promoting things all the time. Every person in the world is motivated to do health-promoting things because, well, with a few exceptions, I suppose, because most people don't want to die. So what you can then deduce, if you think about that for a little while, is that people who are not engaging in health-promoting activities have something in the way. So they have an inherent motivation, but there's something that's taken that away from them. And what we as professionals therefore need to do, what our role is not to give people motivation, but it's to isolate the things that's taking their motivation away and help them work around them. Now, I ain't got time on this podcast, unfortunately, unless you want to make this like 7 hours long, to explain all of self-determination theory, but it breaks off into 3 branches. So there are 3 things that SDT suggests people need in order to express their internal inherent motivation. And they're relatedness, autonomy, and competence. So relatedness is you feel like you're part of something, you feel like other people are on the journey with you, and you feel like you have support structure. Now, PTs can afford that to their clients by being supportive, by encouraging their clients to talk to their friends and family and get support from them, and perhaps by getting your clients to talk to each other and support each other because they're on a similar journey. It's an easy way to do it. You've also got autonomy. That is going to come into motivational interviewing and client-centered coaching. So rather than giving people the answers, because as I explained at the start, a knowledge deficit surplus model doesn't work for chronic conditions. And so the ideas need to come from your client. It's the inception thing. It's like if you need someone to do something, you need to make them think it was their idea. And so the way that you could structure your conversations with clients most of the time would ideally be around asking them questions and leading them to the answer and getting them to think about their problems rather than giving them the answer themselves. Because if you do that, not only do you help them because they get the answer, but next time that situation arises, they already know what the thought process is in order to arrive at what the answer is. And giving people giving people autonomy means that they're not reliant on you for their answers. They don't view you as the expert. They view you as a sounding board and as an assistant, which is, despite what the ego of a lot of fitness people want to make it, that's what you should be, because our goal as fitness professionals should be to make people not need us anymore. Like if your client still needs you 2 years down the line, you haven't done your job. If your client if you have done your job well, however, your client may still be with you in 2 years. Like I've got clients who don't need me anymore, but they just like being coached by me, so they hang around. And I think that's a really cool thing. So that's relatedness and autonomy. So the last one's competence, which is the one that you can use to target learned helplessness. So competence is just the feeling of being able to do the thing, for want of a better way of putting it. And learned helplessness is essentially a removal of competence. It's a removal of a person's perceived ability to actually complete the task that is required to get success out of a given situation. And so if we're looking at nutrition, for example, a lack of competence could be lack of nutrition knowledge, absolutely. People might not know how many calories they need, they might not know how much protein they need, blah, blah, blah. But more likely it's a case of they don't know how to structure the foods that they know they should be eating into their day. The line I use all the time is that there ain't anyone sat out there thinking that crisps are good and broccoli's bad. Like people know what they should be eating, but they don't know how to fit that into their lifestyle, which means that they don't know how to cook the foods, they don't know how to prepare the foods in a way that they will enjoy. They don't know how to buy the foods in a way that won't lead to a bunch of food waste. They don't know how to feed the food to their kids because the kids are picky eaters. They don't know how to not keep snacks in the house because the kids demand them and their partner wants a beer every now and then. And there's all of these things that they don't know how to apply it into their lifestyle. And so that is the competence that they're lacking. It's not the food, it's the how. And what you can do to promote self-determination theory in terms of competence in a way that will help to combat learned helplessness is to set up small wins. So, for example, I don't like this approach because it's very one size fits all, but it's a good illustration. One of the things that precision nutrition do is one of the things of the precision nutrition method, which is why I don't like the precision nutrition method and why I don't think they're very good, is that they tell all of their clients in, right, week 1, what you need to do is you need to take fish oil with breakfast. And that is your first habit. And that is the habit that you should work on this week. And what that does is it sets up an easy win, because it doesn't matter what else a person does. If they do that thing, they have shown themselves that they can successfully make a small lifestyle change, and they have knocked up their competence 1 notch. And then you can set them a slightly bigger win. Right, okay, so you've got your fish oil with breakfast, brilliant. Next thing I want you to do is I want you to make your lunch for work. I don't care what it is. Like you could cook a pizza on the night and take half of that to work with you if you want, but you're packing your food for lunch. And again, it's like, here's a few recipes that you can try. Here's a website where you can find new recipes. And again, once they've done that, that's one win. That's one notch. That's one thing that you've succeeded at. Brilliant. Then you can add it to them. What do you think your next habit should be? And all of a sudden you're putting autonomy in there as well. And you're putting competence in there as well. And this person is just not just improving their nutrition, they're developing as a person because they're realizing that actually they are in control of their life. They are actually in control of the things that they're doing. And by doing that, you build up this person's confidence, you build up this person's self-worth almost. And by doing that over a long period of time, you can overcome learned helplessness. Now, just to finish that bit off, the reason that I don't like that approach for everyone, and the reason that I don't think PN have it right when they advocate it for everyone, is that for some people who don't have learned helplessness, and even for some people that do, that change is too small. And we have this idea that everyone should start small, change one habit at a time, do small things. But let's say you've got 50 pounds to lose, and that's going to take you at best 30 weeks. Realistically, probably a year and a half. Are you going to want to start by just having a fish oil in the morning? No, that's demotivating as hell. Like, you've got a long way to go. You want to start really quickly, and there's no harm in doing that. And I think there is a personalized decision of whether someone should change everything at once, whether someone should almost crash diet in a controlled and coached through manner, or whether someone should start by, for example, cooking their own evening meal instead of buying a ready meal. I don't think it does work for everyone, but in the instance that we're talking about, someone who's yo-yo dieted for years, they've got no confidence in their ability to lose weight, they just feel completely incompetent in the area of improving nutrition, you can get that person to, in the evening, cook their own dinner. All of a sudden they're in control. It's a little something that they weren't in control of before. And that person will then be bigger. They will be better. They will be stronger as a person, and they can start making gradually bigger and bigger changes because these things snowball. And yeah, that's how you overcome it.
So in terms of knowing whether to start big or start small then with someone, Tom, is this where you might use something like a readiness to change questionnaire, or, you know, is there any particular thing that, like a little tool or anything that people can use to maybe highlight that a bit more clearly, or is it just a questioning scenario? What would you recommend for something like that, something simple?
I guess it would depend on what you've put on your readiness to change questionnaire.
Yep.
In yes, I'm very ready to change doesn't tell you how much change you're ready to make. But what I would do is I would just talk to the person. If a person comes to you and says, right, I want to lose loads of weight right now, that's a person who would say, all right then, if you do want to lose loads of weight right now, this is what that looks like. We're going to make sure that you get enough protein. We're going to make sure that you're getting enough vitamins and minerals, and we're going to put you on literally the lowest calorie intake possible for 3 weeks and see how you get on. And I'll coach you through it. And then after that 3 weeks, so you don't just put the weight back on, you don't just binge, I'm going to coach you through that as well. But that's how we're going to start. Does that sound like a good idea? These are going to be the consequences. You're going to be hungry. You're going to feel ratty. You're probably not going to sleep very well. You're going to feel tired throughout the day. But you could potentially lose 3 pounds a week. What do you reckon? And you can judge from their response to that question as to whether or not that's a good idea. Yep. If you get someone who comes in and they're a bit nervous and you're talking about, well, what diets have you tried before, and they're closed in, and you do give them a readiness to change questionnaire, and it just comes across as this is a person that just doesn't feel like they're even ready for this, then yeah, start small. Introduce them slowly. Gradually just improve the things that they do day to day rather than changing everything. But I honestly think that as much as it seems like a good idea to have all these questionnaires and stuff, I think, though they are an important tool, I think minimalism in terms of that is a good approach. And trying to do things as a person rather than a doctor is a good move. I mean, one thing that I tell our students is if you've got a consultation form, it's got all these questions on. Best thing you can do with that is you can email that over to them about a week before your consultation or whatever time frame you've got and say, right, here's this, have a look at it, do it in your own time, send it back to me, and in the consultation we'll talk about it. And then you can sit and you can just have a conversation with the person in the consultation. You can build rapport, you can focus on areas that you think are particularly important, but most importantly, you can build rapport and you can judge what their attitude towards all of this is, and judge what their feelings about all of this are through their intonation, through their body language, and through the words that they say, rather than sitting with a consultation form on a clipboard and a pen and just asking them questions again like a doctor, because I think that approach just makes it seem cold. And if PT and nutrition coaching should be anything, it's not clinical, because we're not clinicians. We're practitioners, I suppose you could say. We're professionals, I suppose, but again, I'll loop back to it. We're relationship professionals. And your client should feel comfortable in your presence, and it's difficult to feel comfortable in the presence of someone with a clipboard. So, yeah, I would do it from a conversational perspective. And again, this is something as well that you'll probably get wrong a few times. You'll make some wrong assumptions with people, and that's fine. Provided you're still communicating with your clients, you'll discover that assumption that was incorrect before they actually start anything, because you'll start talking about a topic and you'll see their face drop. You'll see their eyes glaze over. They'll interject with an objection. Even if this is a person who's not confident enough to interject with an objection, the other signals will be there. And you can say, I'm sensing that you're not really feeling this. What do you reckon? And they'll be like, oh, well. It's like, no, it's fine. Don't worry. This is an alternative approach. How does that one sound? Oh, yeah, that sounds better. And you just need to have the confidence to say, actually, I was wrong. Let's talk about this instead. And it comes with practice.
Yeah. And I think what potentially works really well if you do it like that as well, Tom, is if you talk through it with the person and check in for their reaction, it also gives you an opportunity to manage expectations with a client, because I think sometimes as PTs, that is something that we get wrong. I know I've got it wrong before. And sometimes you need to have the opportunity to say to the person, we can do it this other way, but that isn't going to get the result that you initially thought you were going to get. It is going to be slower, but if it is more sustainable, I'm using air quotes there around sustainable, and if it allows you to do it for longer, then maybe that is the better approach. But I just want to manage your expectations on that, because you're not going to drop the £3 a week on that one. It might be £1. Is that okay?
No, exactly.
I suppose it's finding that balance between the two.
Yeah, I'm a big advocate of treating our clients like adults.
Yeah.
Like a lot of the questions that you get in sort of PT groups and stuff is, I've got this client, what should I do? I'm not sure whether I should do this or I should do this. And it's like, why is that even a question? Ask the client. I don't know. Explain to them. These are the two approaches that I would highlight as being potentially viable for your situation. These are the pros and cons of this one. These are the pros and cons of this one. Which one would you like to give a go of first? And if you don't like it, we'll just change it. But you've managed their expectations there. You've given them the opportunity to make an informed decision. And again, it's client-led. It's not you prescribing stuff. It's you allowing the client to make decisions. And of course, even then, if you present them a binary, you can say, don't worry, it could be something in the middle. Like if you like some bits of this one, some bits of this one, then we'll do that. To go on a slightly different tangent, I suppose, as well, is when we think about diets, I'm using the word diet as a shorthand for a period of time during which you're in a calorie deficit. When we think about diets, we often think that, right, what I need to do is I need to work out how many calories this client needs to eat, or however you're going to do it, and they're going to do that until they've finished. And that's not a good way to look at it, because what that assumes is that this person needs to do the same thing from start to finish, and they absolutely don't. Like, there will be no harm in, next week on the Academy, I'm delivering a case study on one of the clients that I coached. He parted way with me for about a year and a half ago now, but it's a good case study because it illustrates this point quite well. So this guy worked with me, and for the first 2 weeks, his approach was eat as little as possible. So he had a few basic rules, and obviously he agreed to all of this, and we discussed this. I didn't just thrust this upon him. We discussed this, and this was the way that he wanted to give it a go. So his rules were each meal had to have at least 40 grams of protein in it, and he needed to make sure that he was taking a multivitamin every day because he probably wasn't going to eat much else, and he had to eat breakfast as late as possible. That was it. And in those 2 weeks, he lost, I can't remember now because I haven't got my slides in front of me, but an astronomical amount of weight in the first couple of weeks because he was a big dude. And then after that, I coached him through a period of a week where he was eating intentionally in maintenance. And we just brought him back to, right now, you know how to crash diet, good. Now we're going to look to how do you eat to not gain weight? Not to lose, just how to not gain. And that week just gave him a little time to get rid of that hunger, because obviously barely eating anything for a couple of weeks, starving all the time. So kind of got rid of that. And then we did a bunch of rounds of 4 weeks of a moderate calorie deficit interspersed with 1 week of maintenance. And what we did throughout that process was we showed him how to diet in a quote-unquote sustainable way, but then we also showed him how to maintain at various different body weights. And as he got further and further towards his goal weight, he was getting better and better at eating at maintenance. And then when it got to the point where he was like, right, I've lost the weight that I want to do, it's all right, just shuffle into the maintenance thing that you already know how to do. Brilliant, you'll be fine. And by doing it in that sort of phasic manner, which started off with a kickstart, that kickstart motivated him because he saw, Jesus Christ, I can lose weight really quickly. This is good. I've already put a dent in this big thing that I want to try and do. This is brilliant. And because he knew at the end of that little process that he was going to get a week of eating as essentially for effectively as much as he wants, then he didn't mind the fact that he was hungry all the time and that he was feeling a bit lethargic and that, because he's like, oh, I've only got 9 days to go out and do this, or I've only got 3 days left. Come on, let's get this done. And then he had a week where he could kind of eat whatever he wanted, and then he's like, right, I've done the jump start now. Let's do this properly. 4 weeks sensible diet, back at maintenance. 4 weeks sensible diet, back at maintenance. And you could make a physiological argument as to why that's potentially beneficial in terms of things like leptin, but realistically, the benefit of that was more behavioral. It was learning how to do the thing. And if you can view a fat loss approach in those terms, and you can add auto-regulation in there as well. If your client's been dieting for 6 weeks and they're starving, just give them a week at maintenance. It's not the end of the world. And then they can have another 6 weeks of dieting. It's fine. You don't have to eat the same amount throughout the entire diet. And then you can get more granular with that. During a week when you are dieting, you don't have to eat the same number of calories every day. Some days you'll be more hungry than others. Some days you'll be less hungry than others. And you can fluctuate that in an auto-regulatory fashion. You can plan in to have low, medium, high days. However you want to do it, but that's a different podcast.
Yeah, so I think a couple of little key points there to pick out from like a PT perspective, if you're listening into this now, is number one, I think there's a clear message that underlies what Tom's saying, is that you don't have to be right first time. This is a bit of a, let's see what works for you, which is how it should be from the outset. And that might mean getting it wrong a few times, falling off the bike a few times, getting back up again, dusting yourself off and having another go. And then at some point, we're going to take the stabilizers off and let you sort of ride on your own. There's an element of that. And then number two, in that specific case study then that you mentioned, Tom, it's a little bit of giving the person what they want up front, which was the quick weight loss, and then giving them what they need. So it's proven that it's proven that you know how to do this. I've given you that quick weight loss that you were dying for. Now let me talk to you about my way of doing this and giving you some of the tools you actually need to get you to your end goal. So I think those are two key points that sort of underlie that bit there that you just talked about.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I would add in as well to not be afraid of rapid weight loss. Again, stemming on from that idea that I just sort of briefly touched on, diets don't have to be sustainable. And people have this fear of putting people into large calorie deficits, whether that's due to, if they are in a big calorie deficit, then they'll gain more weight later. They won't. The data are very clear on that. People who have more rapid initial weight loss tend to lose more weight over time and maintain their weight loss more effectively. People will damage their metabolism. They won't. That's not how that works. If you look at the data on adaptive thermogenesis, which is what we're talking about when we're talking about metabolic adaptation, the degree to which your basal metabolic rate decreases during a dieting phase is not really predictable by the magnitude of the calorie deficit, and it's not even uniform. So if you have a study, for example, where people are in a 15% calorie deficit, X percentage of them will have a reduction in their basal metabolic rate. If you have a study where they're in a 60% calorie deficit, Y percent of them will have a reduction in their metabolic rate. It's not 100%, and it's difficult to predict which way it's going to go. On top of that, the metabolic adaptation that is noticed by people who are in a big calorie deficit tends to bottom out at about 10% at most. So we're talking like, for an average person, 160 calories. And that ain't going to halt weight loss. And that repairs, in most cases, as soon as you return to baseline calorie intake. So as soon as you return to maintenance, you're not causing damage here. In very obese individuals, it seems to be permanent. You see that from the study on the participants in The Biggest Loser, but that's a separate topic as to whether there's a difference between super obese people and people who are overweight. Probably is. It's to do with fat cell size, but it's a different. But yeah, don't be afraid of putting people into big calorie deficits. The only things that you need to pay attention to is, can this individual do this? Because while the diet doesn't have to be sustainable, it has to be, once again, sustainable for the amount of time that you need to do what you need to do. So if you put someone into a large calorie deficit and by day 3 they're like knee deep in a KFC bucket, then that's not work. That's not a person that can do this approach, and so don't do that approach. You'll only know that by talking to the person, of course. Yeah. And I guess the other thing is, if someone's got a history of like binge restrict, you might want to be a bit careful with that kind of thing. And also, finally, if you're doing it more long term, so what I mentioned there, where I did rapid weight loss with a client, week at maintenance, and then it got more moderate, you don't have to do it that way. The way I personally diet is I'll diet on somewhere between about 800 to 1,000 calories for about 7 to 10 days, and then I'll have a week at maintenance, and I'll just repeat that over and over and over again, because I don't like dieting, but I can do it for 7 to 10 days, and then I need to have my food again. But I can diet really hard for them 7 to 10 days. And the big thing that you need to pay attention to when you're doing that is that obviously that person's micronutrition intake is going to be lower. It's very difficult to get enough iron and calcium if you're not eating a lot of food. And so a multivitamin is useful for rapid fat loss times. But other than that, like, don't be afraid of it. Muscle loss is a lot harder to achieve than you think. If a person is relatively untrained, they ain't going to lose muscle if they're eating enough protein and training. And even if a person is well trained, if they're lifting properly, so if they're actually lifting with intensity, if they manage to keep the weight on the bar and they're eating enough protein, they ain't going to lose muscle. There was one study in pro rugby players in a large calorie deficit, and they gained muscle because they added exercise volume. Like, you're not going to lose muscle. A lot of the time, what you see when you lose muscle is, if a study's been done using participants with DEXA scans, the DEXA scan's unable to differentiate between muscle tissue and glycogen. And so they're obviously going to lose muscle mass if they're in a big calorie deficit, because they're going to lose glycogen. And in the real world, the two situations are, people don't try to keep weight on the bar, they try to keep the volume. So if you're doing 5 sets of 5, for example, and you go into a big calorie deficit, well, you're going to be tired. You ain't going to be able to do 5 sets of 5 with the same weight. So what a lot of people do is they'll drop 10% off the bar and keep their 5 by 5. Congratulations, you just got weaker, you're going to lose muscle. Evidence suggests you can drop your exercise volume by about 60% without losing muscle mass, provided you maintain the weight on the bar. And so if you were to drop to 2 sets of 5, that's going to maintain muscle. So when people don't do that, that's when they lose muscle during a diet. And the other one is, most people just aren't as big as they think they are. Like, you get a little bit of fat around a bicep, that bicep will still look very lean, but as soon as you lose that bicep, it's going to look smaller. And then you've got intramuscular triglycerides, which are, you get a steak and it's got marble in, that's that. It's just fat that's within the muscle. That'll go when you lose fat as well. And so that's going to make your muscle look smaller. You've not lost muscle, you're just not as big as you thought you were. And that generally is where people lose muscle mass from. So yeah, rapid fat loss is not the boogeyman that people think it is.
Awesome. So we've covered some pretty hefty topics there in a very short space of time. That was good going, that, Tom. Yeah. I want to sort of, as we bring this towards the end, I want to ask you a few sort of like more quick fire type questions, just to get your thoughts on a few different areas, especially around the area of like education, because obviously you are an educator. A lot of people listening to this like to learn. So to start that off, I'd like to talk about like what have been 2 or 3 of the most influential books on your own like career growth, or, you know, you've already mentioned the motivational interviewing one. Are there any ones in particular that maybe aren't nutrition based that have had an influence on you?
Ooh, that's a good question. I missed that in the brief. So The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. It's a very good book. Yep. That explains, well, habits, what they are. I think if you're the type of person that can take a topic and then go down a rabbit hole with it, Free Will by Sam Harris is very good. while completely not nutrition-based, you can apply the stuff that he mentions in there to an awful lot of situations regarding personal training and fitness, and I think you can take from that some of the stuff that I've said today. It's about 70 pages long as well, which is a bonus. Poverty Safari, I can't remember the guy who wrote it, he's a Scottish guy. That is a very, very good insight into a lot of things to do with wealth inequality and all that nonsense, but part of that, he explains why he ate and lived in a generally unhealthy fashion despite the fact he had no money. Like, it's expensive to eat bad food and smoke, but poor people do it all the time. And Poverty Safari is a good insight into that. And also, I would say, I mean, one of the things that I'm not going to say known for because no one knows who I am. One of the things that I think I do quite well is writing. And so I would say, I mean, the novel Shogun is an absolutely phenomenal novel. People ask me sometimes, I'm not going to say it all the time because that's what all influencer people say, and no one ever actually asks you that question, like you've been asked it twice. But some people do ask me, like, do you have any books on how to write better blogs or how to write better emails or even how to speak better and to sort of construct a narrative? And the answer is no. Like, if you read a really good novel, you'll get more information in that about how to construct a narrative and how to write than you would ever get from a book on writing. So I do believe firmly that anyone who works in an industry like ours, which thrives on communication, would benefit significantly from reading more novels. Just pick good ones.
yeah, just pick well-written ones.
Yeah.
What do you see as, we might end up down a rabbit hole here, Tom, just to make you aware. What do you see as next in the nutrition space? And what I mean by asking that question is that, you know, I've been in the industry sort of 8-9 years now, and our views on nutrition have changed a lot in that time. I know that there's still some separation between what we believe about food and then what the general population believe about food. There's a massive movement at the minute towards plant-based eating, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. You know, I think people eating more plants is a good thing. You know, I'm still a meat eater myself, but I do believe that more people should eat more plants, definitely. What do you see as being this next sort of phase or evolution of where we go with nutrition? We've had the, you know, the carb-free diets, we've had the gluten-free, we've had the dairy-free, we're now on plant-based. Like, where do you see this ending up? Where does this journey take us?
I've got two answers to that. So the first one is, I think the polarization will continue. I think, as it has in politics and philosophy and various other areas of life, social media has increased the perceived dichotomies between people. And I think that the vegan movement is going to continue going strong. I mean, the Canadian National Nutritional recommendations are largely plant-based now, and I think while they were the first country to do it, I don't think by any stretch of the imagination they will be the last, despite significant lobbying by meat and dairy industry. I will reveal my bias in that I eat quite a lot of meat and dairy, by the way. And when I say that, I'm not saying that from the perspective that I think that's good because I'm vegan, because I'm definitely not. I just think that's going to be a thing. So there will be an increase in plant-based diet. And I think social media also increases the degree to which people can engage in vegan activism. Like, if you look at all of the videos about animal cruelty and mistreatment on various different farms, one of the interesting biases that people have is, I think it's called exposure bias, but basically the thing that you see all the time is the thing that you believe to be true. So, for example, if there's a poll somewhere where if you look at the crime rates in the US since like the 70s, they've gone down year on year and they're actually really low at the minute. And then if you look at the perceived crime rates since the 70s, they were kind of level and then they went up almost in like a 1-to-1. As crime went down, crime perception went up around about the time we got a 24-hour news cycle. And it's because people are exposed to crime all the time. Well, vegan activism on the internet is very effective because you can take, let's say there are 100 farms around the world that treat their animals horribly. You'll get an awful lot of social media coverage from those 100 farms. And despite the fact that there's got 1 million farms, I don't know, around the world, those 100 are the one that you'll see all the time. And so we will extrapolate that to believe that that's what all farms are like. And so that will increase people's anger, which increases people's activism. So I think the vegan thing is going to continue. And as you mentioned, there are a lot of positives to that. If someone's going to tell me I'm going to eat a well-balanced vegan diet, good, you'll probably be healthier for it. But at the same time, I think that is going to create a rift, and the carnivore diet will sit in the middle of that. I think the carnivore diet will become more and more popular as more people talk about it. You've got who are the more influential people in the world at the minute. You've got someone like Joe Rogan. He eats a very low carbohydrate diet, and he often talks to people who follow a carnivore diet or a ketogenic diet. And I think that the popularity of that is not going anywhere. I think that's going to continue. So I think those two camps are going to grow, and they will get louder. Although I don't actually think they will ever get that big. I think they'll just get really loud. And so I think they'll be the trends. But as I've mentioned, it's exposure bias. I mean, the whole gluten-free thing, probably less than 1% of 1% of people around the world ever cut gluten out, but it was just talked about a lot. And so we heard about it a lot, and so we thought it was a big thing. It probably wasn't. So maybe that'll be the trend. The other side is a thing that I think I would like PTs and nutrition coaches to be very, very acutely aware of, and that's AI. Like, you may think that what we do can't be done by AI, but it very much can. Like, anyone who's got an Alexa right now, ask it how many calories you have to eat in a day, and it'll tell you the government recommendations. Give it 5 years, and that'll start asking follow-up questions. Give it 10 years, and it'll start giving a lot of follow-up questions. 10 years' time, I dare say that the job of most nutritionists and PTs can be done by AI. The way that you need to differentiate yourself is with the human touch. It's the stuff that I've spoken about today. It's the communication, it's the empathy, it's the understanding of intonation, it's the managing to work with people not on an algorithmic basis, but on an in the real world experience-based understanding of human beings, because that's 50 years away, maybe, as a stab, I don't know. But I think in 10 years' time, if you're not looking at things like self-determination theory, client-led coaching, which all PTs are told about at level 3, but no one ever emphasizes it, motivational interviewing, looking into things like psychological models such as learned helplessness, or even looking at the philosophy, like the whole thing about free will. I think if you're ignoring all of those areas and you're just focusing on learning the ins and outs of how to get someone to eat the most optimal diet in the world, or how to write the most optimal exercise program for a person that trains twice a week and works in Tesco's, then if you're only focusing on that, that is the kind of stuff that can be done by algorithms. That's the kind of stuff that can be done by your Google Assistant. Just not yet. But if you're focusing on the human connection, you will have a future-proof business, because AI can't do human yet. And so I think that will be the big trend that's not right on the doorstep, but that's the one to really think about.
Yeah, cool. Something that we've not really heard on the podcast before, so I think that will set a few light bulbs off in people's heads. Last sort of quick fire question then, Tom. You coach. That's something you're clearly very good at. For the people listening to this that are still learning how to become a better coach and that, I think something that helps is if you've got a good set of tools that you can use with clients. Are there any particular things that you rely on for your coaching business? Are there any things that you use on a regular basis that helps you check in with people, that helps you monitor what they're doing, or whatever it is that you like to use?
So I'm a dinosaur.
Tom uses a chalkboard.
I have a handwritten diary. I have Excel, I have emails, I have Dropbox, and I have WhatsApp, and that's how I run my clients. Now, I'm going to caveat that. My full-time job is working for the BTN Academy, and my full-time job is as an educator. My coaching amounts to, I cap it at 6 clients. Yep. And so yep. I can do that.
Yep.
If you have clients, because that is your full-time job and that is what you need to do, you've got 30 clients on the go, you ain't going to keep up with that with dinosaur admin. And so things like my PT Hub, I've never used it, but my girlfriend has a PT who uses it, and I can say from the client's perspective, it's really good. And so I would look at stuff like that. In terms of other things that I used to help me, I mean, That's about it. I'm not the one to answer that question, I'm afraid.
No, that's fine. I suppose anything that allows you to stay organised with these things. If you're dealing with a lot of people, you've got to be organised, haven't you? You've got to know where you're up to with everyone.
I guess two things that I could say is, I guess, first of all, the first take home you can take from that is, if you're just starting out and you haven't got any clients, you don't need all of that complicated shit yet.
Yep.
Like, you can start off until you've got 10 clients using a notepad and pen and Excel. Like, that's fine. You get started. Don't be sat there waiting until you've got the perfect piece of software before you go and find your first 3 clients, because you're wasting time. And the other one I do actually use is Calendly. So Calend, as if you're going to write calendar, but then it's a dot and then it's ly. That is very good. It's a scheduling piece of software. So what you can do is you can let Calendly know when you're available. Then you can give out your Calendly link and people can book themselves in. So if you're doing online coaching like what I do, you can use your Calendly link and you can give it away to your clients, and your clients can book themselves in during times which you're available. And all that does is it just stops you having to message your client going, oh, can you do 4? And then they'll come back 2 hours later. Actually, can you do 5? And then you go, oh, 5's a bit busy. Can you do 4:30? And then they come back to you later, and then you forget, and then you never get it booked. Calendly link is like, look, that's when I'm available. Book yourself in, and I'll see you then. The Calendly is a really useful piece of software. I use that for booking the calls for people who are potentially interested in the academy, but it's very useful for coaches too.
Cool. Good. Some good recommendations there, Tom. It's been awesome having you on, Tom. We've covered some really good stuff today. Is there anything that you want to sort of finish off with in terms of like a key takeaway? Is there anything that you sort of would love to finish off with today? Anyone that does nutrition coaching or influences people's nutrition, is there any sort of little sign off that you'd like to give them?
So there's 3. So the first one is to loop back to the AI thing. If you don't believe that artificial intelligence can replace what you do, know that there was a patent filed somewhere around 6 months ago, which was for basically like an Under Armour skin thing. It wasn't Under Armour, but it was an Under Armour skin thing. And that could track a person's heart rate, blood pressure, blood glucose, body weight, and weight gain and loss by testing how stretched it was. And that could then predict, using algorithms, that person's ideal calorie and carbohydrate intake, as well as recommended protein intake based on their body weight. That's already been invented. And so if you think that your job is safe for the next 2 years, and all you're doing is you're using a macronutrient calculator on the internet and then telling people to use MyFitnessPal, you need to do more. So that would be my first take home. My second one would be to remember that there are principles and then there are systems. And the principle that a client needs to adhere to in terms of nutrition, unless they're an athlete when things get a bit more complicated, is calories, ideally whole foods, lots of plants, and enough protein. You can use any system to get to those goals, be that intermittent fasting, the 5-2 diet, ketogenic diet, veganism, the carnivore diet. There's a lot of different approaches that you can use to get to those principles, and the system itself actually doesn't matter at all. And so you can mix and match between the two. There is no such thing as no, I'm not going to say that because there is. So you don't have to gel yourself to a system, and you also don't have to be completely opposed to a system. There was a lot of hype around intermittent fasting, and most of it was misguided. And so people are now saying that intermittent fasting isn't a evidence-based approach. You also get low carb. Or you don't need to be on a low-carb diet, ergo, you shouldn't be on a low-carb diet. That second half is a person's opinion. You don't need to be on a low-carb diet, but if you can adhere well to a low-carbohydrate diet because it includes foods that you prefer and it helps to better manage your appetite, then a low-carb diet is the evidence-based recommendation for that individual. And so make sure that you're separating the difference between principles and systems, because a bad system for one person might be a good system for another person if it allows them to adhere to the principles. And then the opposite's also true. And the final one is to just remember that your clients are grown adult human beings. Talk to them like adults. Respect the autonomy that they have. Respect their opinions. When someone comes to you and has what you believe is an excuse, critically think as to whether that is an excuse or whether it's a reason. Because just because if someone comes to you and says, oh, they don't have time to exercise, your visceral reaction may be, because I know mine sometimes is, well, you get up at 8 a.m. You could get up at 6 a.m. and there's your 2 hours. There's your time to exercise. And that's fine. And you can then say, well, that's an excuse. But if that person sincerely believes that their excuse is a reason that they can't do something, then that is a barrier that you need to help them work through. And by telling them to get up at 6, all you've done there is you've essentially scolded them for not thinking of that idea first. And that's where, okay, so you're saying you don't have enough time. Well, we've got 2 options. You can either stop doing something, or we need to find somewhere that you can get extra time. Where do you think we could find some extra time in your day? And just narrow them down until they find the answer. Because they're an autonomous adult. They'll work it out.
Yeah, definitely. That last one's key. I think that last one's a massive one for people to take away. Tom, if we want to find you anywhere, where's the best place to come and find you? Where can we come and look at some of the cool stuff that you're doing? Give us a little insight into where the best place is to come and absorb some of your knowledge. Yeah,
awesome. So the best place to find me if you're wanting stuff like this is through the BTN Academy. So that is BTN Academy Nutrition Education on Facebook, or at BTN Academy on Instagram. If you go to btn.academy, you will find our website. On the right-hand side of the homepage, you can download a free course. What that free course will do is it'll give you 1 week of nutrition education with myself and Ben. And then after that, you'll be entered onto our email list, where you'll get 2 emails from me per week, which are around this sort of stuff. I like to think, well, I generally put my best stuff in the emails, so you'll want to check that out. I also write blogs for the BTN Academy, so again, follow us on Instagram and Facebook, and you'll see when the blogs are coming out. I've just written 2, one on how to eat and train around the menstrual cycle, and one on a little bit more about the whole adaptive thermogenesis metabolic adaptation thing, where I present all of the evidence and the data on that. All my blogs have always got far too many references, so yeah, check that out. If you're interested in me as a person for whatever reason, my Instagram handle is Tom Bainbridge 1990. It's got no nutrition or anything on there at all. That's my sport, so I'm a field archer. As Matt can see behind me, I've got a bunch of archery equipment behind me. So you'll see lots of archery things. I also make things out of wood and metal. So recently made a couple of knives, an axe. So you'll find all my outdoorsy adventures on there if that's the kind of thing that you want to look at. Cool, yeah. I'm sure people will check that out. So that's it for today, Tom. I do believe we could have talked for a lot longer, but as I said before we hit record, us PTs haven't got the longest attention span, so we'll leave it there for today. So yeah, thank you very much for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure having you, mate. Not a problem, Matt. Cheers for having me on. It's been awesome.